smells so good!
It sure does. Your mom's a great cook.
Are they ready?
Almost, just a second.
She framed a black man for rape, the 14-year prison truth that finally set him free. The ballroom was electric. 350 of Atlanta's most powerful people packed into the Grand Meridian Hotel, judges, senators, real estate dynasties, Silicon Valley transplants with Georgia money and New York ambition. Crystal chandeliers, marble everything. The kind of room where a single handshake could move $100 million. They were all there for one reason: to meet the mystery billionaire who had just purchased every single asset belonging to the Whitmore family, the most untouchable name in Atlanta's history. Cash deal, no negotiation, no warning. No one knew his face. No one knew his name. The lights dimmed, the host stepped to the microphone, and when he spoke the name of Atlanta's newest and most dangerous billionaire, a woman in the front row stopped breathing. Her crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It didn't just fall, it exploded on the marble floor. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Because she knew that name. 14 years ago, she pointed her finger at him and destroyed him. 14 years ago, she looked a jury of 12 people in the eyes and cried, and they believed every single word. 14 years ago, she watched them put handcuffs on an innocent man, a father, a husband, a human being, and she said nothing. She did nothing. And now, he had just bought her family's estate, her childhood home, her father's company, the ground her family had stood on for 3 generations. He owned all of it. He owned her. Before I take you into what happened next, if you've ever believed that the truth has a long memory, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because the payback David Paul delivers in this story, it doesn't just burn bridges, it levels empires. Now let me take you back to where it all began. David Paul was not supposed to be extraordinary. And that was exactly the problem. At 29 years old, he was the kind of man who made people comfortable: warm brown eyes, a gentle smile, the sort of face that made strangers trust him before he even opened his mouth. He wasn't flashy. He drove a clean but modest car. He lived in a 3-bedroom house in Decatur with his wife Maya and their 2 children, a daughter who wanted to be an astronaut, a son who still ran to the door every evening when he heard his father's key in the lock. He coached Little League on Saturdays. He remembered birthdays. He was the man neighbors called when something broke because David Paul always showed up. He had no enemies. That's what made him the perfect target. David Paul believed in small things. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he understood that the small things were the big things. The smell of Maya's cooking filling the house on Sunday mornings. His daughter Zoe's laugh, loud and unashamed, the kind of laugh that made strangers smile in grocery stores. His son Marcus, 7 years old and already convinced his father was the strongest man alive, climbing onto his back every evening like David was a mountain built specifically for him. This was the empire David Paul had built. And to him, it was worth more than anything on the Atlanta skyline. He worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown, smart enough to have gone further, humble enough not to need to. His colleagues respected him. His boss had quietly flagged him for a senior role. He wore the same watch his father gave him at graduation, a modest silver thing with a small scratch on the face that he refused to repair because his father's hands had put it there. Maya used to tease him about that watch. "You're the only man I know who treats a scratch like a trophy," she'd say, and he'd pull her clothes and tell her that some marks were worth keeping. They had met in college. She was studying nursing, he was studying numbers, and somehow the combination had made perfect sense. They weren't a perfect couple. They argued about money sometimes, about the future, about whether to move to a bigger house or stay rooted in the neighborhood they loved, but they always came back to each other. Always. On the evening of September 14th, a Thursday, unremarkable in every way, David stayed late at work to finish a client report. He stopped for gas on the way home. He bought Marcus a chocolate bar from the station because that was their thing, a Thursday ritual that had no origin story except love. He came home, he ate dinner, he put his children to bed. He had no idea it was the last normal night of his life. 3 days later, a woman named Sarah Whitmore walked into an Atlanta police precinct and told a story. A detailed, tearful, devastatingly convincing story. She described a man. She gave his name. She pressed her pale, trembling hand to her chest and told them she was terrified. The officers believed her before she finished the first sentence. By Monday morning, David Paul was sitting in a cold interrogation room in handcuffs, staring at a metal table, asking a question that no one in that building had any interest in answering. Why? Outside, Marcus was waiting by the front door with a chocolate bar in his hand, wondering why his father hadn't come home. He would wait for 14 years. Sarah Whitmore had never been told no. Not really, not in any way that left a mark. She had grown up wrapped in the particular armor of old Atlanta money, the kind of wealth that didn't announce itself loudly but simply arranged things, quietly, efficiently, without apology. Her father sat on 3 corporate boards and played golf with the district attorney. Her mother chaired the city's most prestigious charity gala every spring. Sarah had been handed a life so carefully constructed that consequence had never truly found her address. She was 26 years old, blonde, composed, the kind of woman a courtroom looks at and instinctively wants to protect. She knew exactly what she was doing. The details of why Sarah chose David Paul, why him, why that week, what personal disaster she needed to bury beneath his name would not surface for 14 years, but the mechanics of what she did were surgical. She had studied her own reflection before walking into that precinct. She had worn no makeup, just enough to look rawly human. She had rehearsed the tremor in her voice until it felt like breathing. And when she sat across from the detective and began to speak, she cried at precisely the right moments. The arrest made the local news by Tuesday. By Wednesday, it had metastasized into something uglier: David's photograph circulating alongside words that attached themselves to a man's name like a permanent stain. His colleagues stopped returning calls. His neighbors, the same ones he'd helped with broken pipes and dead car batteries, found reasons to look away. The trial lasted 9 days. David's attorney was court-appointed, overworked, carrying 43 other cases. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man with too little time and too few resources, standing in a room where the architecture of power had already made its decision. Sarah took the stand on the 4th day. She was flawless. She spoke in a calm, measured voice that occasionally fractured just enough, never too much. She made eye contact with the jury. She wore a pale blue blouse. She folded her hands in her lap like a woman carrying something unbearable with quiet dignity, and every person in that courtroom leaned toward her without realizing they were doing it. David watched the jury watch her. And he understood with a cold clarity that settled into his bones like winter that his innocence was not going to be enough. He was right. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon, 12 people, 38 minutes of deliberation, guilty. Maya collapsed in the gallery. Zoe didn't understand what was happening. Marcus, too young to be there, was home with David's mother, who would have to find the words later that evening to explain to a 7-year-old boy why his father wasn't coming back. David Paul stood at the defendant's table and did not cry. He simply looked at Sarah Whitmore one final time. She was already looking away. The first thing prison takes is your name. They don't announce it, there's no ceremony. It happens quietly, bureaucratically, a number replacing the thing your mother gave you, a uniform replacing the clothes that smelled like your house, a cell replacing every room where someone once loved you. David Paul became an inmate, a case number, a cautionary tale whispered in the neighborhood he used to coach Little League in on Saturday mornings. The first year was the hardest because hope was still alive in it. He filed appeals, he wrote letters. He called Maya every week from a payphone that cost money he didn't have, feeding quarters into a machine just to hear her voice, just to hear his children argue in the background about something meaningless and beautiful. He told her to be strong. He told her the truth would surface. He told her to wait. Maya waited for 3 years. Then one morning, a letter arrived that contained no explanation, just finality. She had met someone, she needed to move forward. She was sorry, she would always be sorry. David sat on the edge of his bunk and held that letter until the lights went out. He didn't sleep that night or the next. The years that followed arrived in a blur of violence, monotony, and quiet devastation. He watched men break around him, good men, broken men, men who had done terrible things and men who had done nothing at all. He learned quickly that survival in prison required a specific kind of stillness, not weakness, not surrender, a controlled, watchful calm that kept you invisible to the wrong people and present enough to protect yourself when invisibility failed. He fought when he had to, he bled when he had to. But somewhere in the 4th year, something shifted. It started with a book. The prison library was a neglected room with flickering fluorescent lights and shelves of donated paperbacks that smelled like other people's houses. David had walked past it for months without stopping. Then one afternoon, with nowhere to be and nothing left to lose, he walked in. He picked up a book on contract law. He didn't know why. He read it in 2 days. Then he read another. Then a finance textbook with a broken spine. Then a biography of a man who had built a business empire from a single room with no money and no connections, only strategy, patience, and an obsessive refusal to accept the story the world had written for him. David Paul read that biography 4 times. Something ignited. He began requesting books by title. He studied law, finance, real estate, corporate strategy. He found a prison educator who recognized the look in his eyes, not desperation but hunger, and quietly brought him material that went beyond the library's shelves. He stopped counting what he had lost. He started calculating what he would build. 5,110 days, that was what Sarah Whitmore had taken from him. He intended to collect every single one. While David Paul was learning to survive, Sarah Whitmore was learning to forget. She was remarkably good at it. Within a year of the trial, she had relocated to a beautiful townhouse in Buckhead, funded quietly by her father, who never asked questions and never required answers. She joined a new social circle, people who didn't know the details, or if they did, accepted the version she had carefully presented. She redecorated her life the way some people redecorate rooms, removing anything that reminded her of what had happened, replacing it with things that were clean and new and unburdened. She told herself she had done what was necessary. She told herself this so many times that eventually it stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling like weather, something that had simply happened beyond anyone's control, beyond anyone's fault. By her late 20s, she was engaged to a man named Carter Whitmore, no relation, just a coincidence of names that Atlanta's social pages found charming. He was handsome, successful, uncomplicated. He adored her. He asked no difficult questions because Sarah had never given him reason to ask any. She was the perfect partner, composed, warm when it counted, and masterfully skilled at steering conversations away from certain years, certain subjects, certain silences she needed him never to notice. They married in the spring. The reception had 200 guests and fresh peonies on every table. Sarah smiled in every photograph. 2 years later, she gave birth to a boy. They named him James. From the moment she held him, something changed in Sarah that she had not anticipated and could not immediately name. It wasn't just love she had expected love. It was something rawer and more disorienting than that. Looking into her son's face, so new and so entirely innocent, she felt the specific vertigo of holding something that deserved a world that was clean. A world she had made dirty. She pushed the feeling down. She was practiced at that. James grew with the easy confidence of a child who had never known scarcity, not of money, not of affection. He was bright and gentle, with a wide grin and his mother's light eyes. He loved soccer. He loved building things. He followed Carter around the house on weekends with a toy toolkit, convinced that helping meant holding the flashlight steady. Sarah watched him and felt, for the first time, genuinely proud of something. And then one evening, when James was 6 years old, he asked her a question that children ask without understanding the weight of what they're carrying. "Mama, is it true that sometimes good people get punished for things they didn't do?" He had heard something at school, a story, something a teacher had said about fairness. Sarah set down her wine glass very carefully. "Where did you hear that?" she asked. "Is it true, though?" She looked at her son's open, trusting face. And for the first time in 6 years, she couldn't find the words to answer. The years passed the way guilt passes, never cleanly, never completely, always leaving a residue. Sarah had built an architecture of normalcy so elaborate and so well-maintained that most days she almost believed in it herself. The charity work, the school fundraisers, the dinner parties where she laughed at the right moments and refilled glasses before they were empty and made every guest feel like the most important person in the room. She was good at surfaces. She had always been good at surfaces. But James kept growing. And the older he grew, the louder the silence became. She noticed it first when he was 11, the way he carried himself, gentle but certain, the way he looked at people directly when he spoke to them, the way he defended a smaller boy at school without being asked and then said nothing about it at dinner because to James, it simply wasn't worth mentioning. You did the right thing because it was the right thing, that was the entire equation. Sarah had watched him that evening from across the table and felt something cold move through her chest. She recognized that quality. She had destroyed it once in another person a long time ago. Then James turned 14. It happened on a Sunday in October, cake, candles, Carter's arm around her shoulders, neighbors crowding their backyard with laughter and the smell of grilled food. James blew out the candles and the crowd cheered and Sarah stood at the edge of it all, smiling the smile she had perfected over a decade. And suddenly the numbers cracked open inside her mind like a fault line splitting the earth. 14. David Paul had been 29 when they took him. He had been inside for 14 years now, the same number of years her son had been alive. The same number of years she had been sleeping in a clean bed in a quiet house beside a man who trusted her completely. She looked at James, laughing, healthy, free, and for the first time she allowed herself to see it fully. Not the vague discomfort she had managed and suppressed for years, but the true, unobstructed shape of what she had done. She had stolen this, 14 years of someone's son, someone's father, someone's life. And the universe had been watching the entire time. That night, after the guests left and Carter slept and the house settled into stillness, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen and stared at her hands. The same hands that had pressed against her chest in that courtroom. The same hands that had gestured toward an innocent man while 12 people watched and believed and condemned. She started shaking and couldn't stop. The fear that came for her then was not abstract. It was specific and physical and absolute, the terror of a mother who understood bone deep that the debt she had buried had never disappeared. It had only been waiting for the right moment to collect. She didn't sleep for 11 days. Not real sleep, not the kind that restores anything. She would drift for an hour, maybe two, and then something would pull her back to the surface, gasping, heart-hammering, James's birthday candles still burning behind her eyes. Carter noticed. He asked gentle questions she deflected with practiced ease. She told him it was stress, a hormone imbalance, something the doctor was monitoring. He believed her because he had always believed her, and that the ease of it, the reflexive way his trust landed on her like a gift she had never deserved, made everything worse. On the 12th morning, she got up before dawn, dressed quietly, and drove to her father's house. He was already awake, the way old men who carry old secrets tend to be. He saw her face when she walked through the door and he set down his coffee cup very slowly. He didn't ask what was wrong. He waited, the way powerful men wait, with the quiet certainty that they can still fix whatever is coming. Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table where she had eaten 1,000 breakfasts as a child, and she told him everything. Not the version, not the arrangement, everything. When she finished, the room was absolutely silent. Her father looked at her for a long time. Then he looked out the window at his garden, the immaculate, carefully ordered garden he tended every morning, as though control over living things could substitute for other kinds of control. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice low and measured, "think very carefully about what you are considering." "I already have," she said, "for 14 years. She walked into the Atlanta Police Department at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with a detective. She sat in a gray room not unlike the one David Paul had sat in 14 years earlier, and she gave a full recorded confession. Every detail, every calculation, every lie named and dated and delivered without the performance she had once perfected so completely. She did not cry. She had decided she had no right to. The legal machinery that had moved so swiftly to destroy David Paul moved considerably slower to correct itself. There were filings, hearings, reviews. Attorneys argued over procedure while a man sat in a cell waiting for the world to acknowledge what he had known every single day for 5,110 days. But the gates did open. On a cold Wednesday morning in January, David Paul walked out of Hayes State Prison in a jacket a prison volunteer had donated, carrying everything he owned in a single canvas bag. He stood in the parking lot and looked up at the open sky for a long time. No cameras, no crowd, no fanfare. Just a man and the sky, and 14 years of silence finally, irrevocably broken. He took one breath. Then he started walking. The world had changed in 14 years. The phones were different, the city was different. The skyline had new teeth. People walked with their eyes pointed downward at small glowing screens, moving through Atlanta like they were navigating a map only they could see. David Paul watched all of it with the patient, analytical stillness of a man who had spent over a decade studying systems, how they were built, how they moved, and precisely where they were weakest. He started with nothing. By design, he started with nothing because he had learned in the prison library that the most dangerous kind of builder is the one who has already lost everything and therefore has no fear of losing anything again. Fear was the tax that slowed other men down. David Paul had already paid it in full. He found a room in a boarding house in Decatur, the same neighborhood where he had once coached Little League, and he paid the first month's rent with money from a prisoner reentry fund. He owned one jacket, one pair of shoes, and a notebook he had carried out of Hayes filled with 14 years of financial models, legal strategy, and market analysis written in the careful, compressed handwriting of a man with unlimited time and absolute focus. Within 3 months, he had leveraged a wrongful conviction settlement into a seed position. Within 6, he had tripled it. He moved quietly and he moved fast, the way a person moves when they have already mapped the terrain in their mind long before their feet touch the ground. He targeted undervalued assets with structural weaknesses, distressed properties, mismanaged portfolios, companies bleeding quietly from poor leadership while their owners attended galas and congratulated themselves on inherited success. He had studied this category of owner very specifically. He knew exactly what careless privilege looked like from the inside. The Whitmore family's holdings had not aged well. Sarah's father had made several catastrophic investments in the decade prior, losses papered over with debt and the stubborn confidence of a man who had never truly been held accountable by a market that didn't know his name. The estate was leveraged. The company was hollowed. The family's reputation was the last valuable asset they possessed, and reputation, David Paul had learned, was remarkably fragile when someone with the right information applied the right pressure at the right moment. He spent 8 months executing the acquisition with the precision of a surgeon who had rehearsed the procedure 10,000 times. When the final transfer documents were signed, David sat alone in a downtown office he now owned outright, in a building that had once hosted a fundraiser for the very prosecutor who had celebrated his conviction, and he looked at the papers for a long time. He felt no triumph. Not yet. There was still one thing left to do. One conversation that 14 years of preparation had been quietly, inevitably building toward. He had rehearsed this moment 10,000 times. In his bunk at Hayes, in the prison library, in the boarding house room in Decatur, in the quiet hours before Atlanta woke up and the city remembered it had somewhere to be, he had imagined this conversation in every possible shape. What he would say, how they would look, whether they would let him finish before they walked away. He had never once imagined it would be this hard. Zoe was 23 now. She opened the door of her apartment in East Atlanta and stood in the frame looking at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She had Maya's eyes. She had his jaw. She was wearing scrubs. She was studying to be a nurse. Someone had told him that, and the information had sat inside his chest like a splinter of light for weeks. She had grown up without him and still chosen to spend her life taking care of people. He didn't know what to do with that. "I know you were told things," he said, because he had promised himself he would not begin with an apology. Not because he wasn't sorry, he was sorry for every year and every missed morning and every version of himself she had never got to know. But he refused to walk into his daughter's life for the first time in 14 years carrying his innocence like a request for forgiveness. He was not here to beg, he was here to tell the truth. So he told it. He sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours and laid it out plainly, not with anger, not with performance, but with the same clear, methodical precision he had applied to everything since the prison library had given him back his mind. The accusation, the trial, the system that had processed him like something disposable, the years, the letters he had written that Maya in her pain had never passed on, the confession that had finally opened the gates. Zoe listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she got up, filled 2 glasses of water, set one in front of him, and sat back down. "Marcus won't see you," she said. "Not yet. It's going to take him longer." "I know," David said. He built a whole life around the story he was given. "I know that too." She looked at him the way people look at someone they are trying to find inside a stranger's face, searching for something familiar beneath all the years and damage and distance. "You look like I remember," she said finally, quietly, like it surprised her. "You look like your mother," he said. "You have her eyes." Something shifted in Zoe's expression then, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the door to it cracking open by an inch. She didn't ask him to leave. The invitation arrived on a Monday. Sarah found it on her desk, cream envelope, no return address, her name written in a clean, unfamiliar hand. Inside, a single card, an address in Buckhead, a time, and 4 words at the bottom that stopped the air in her lungs. "We should speak privately." No signature, none was needed. Carter was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. James was at soccer practice. The house smelled like coffee and normalcy and the life she had constructed so carefully over so many years, and Sarah stood in the middle of it and understood with absolute clarity that she was going to go. She had been waiting for this moment since the morning she had walked into that police precinct, perhaps longer, perhaps since the night she first held James and felt the fault line open beneath her feet. Some debts announce themselves, others simply wait by the door. The address was a tower in the heart of Buckhead, glass and steel, 40 floors, the kind of building that rewrites a skyline. The lobby was quiet and immaculate. A man at the desk directed her to the elevator without asking her name. The doors opened onto a private floor and she walked through it slowly, taking in the city of Atlanta spread out through floor-to-ceiling windows like an offering. David Paul was standing on the balcony. He didn't turn when she stepped outside. He was looking at the city the way a man looks at something he has earned, not with arrogance, but with the deep, settled ownership of someone who understands precisely what it cost. Sarah stopped a few feet behind him. The wind moved between them. "David, you don't need to apologize," he said, still not turning. His voice was calm, completely calm in the way that only certain kinds of hard-won peace can produce. "I didn't bring you here for that." She waited. He turned then and looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah felt the full weight of it. Not hatred, something more difficult than hatred. Recognition. He saw her completely, every layer, every calculation, every year of careful forgetting, and he was entirely unmoved by any of it. "I brought you here so you could see this," he said, gesturing once toward the city below. "All of it, because you should know what you were trying to bury when you pointed your finger at me." Sarah's eyes filled, her mouth opened. "I had nothing when I walked out of that prison," David continued. "One jacket, one bag. 14 years of a life you decided didn't matter." He paused. "The person you threw away built an empire from your ashes. I need you to understand that, not for me. I made my peace with those 5,110 days a long time ago." "Then why?" Her voice broke. "For James," he said simply. "So his mother knows exactly what a lie costs, so he never learns it from you the hard way." He looked at her one final time. Then David Paul turned back to his city and said nothing more.